Okay, everyone, welcome to the Forum for Law, Ethics, and Society. Today we have Dr. Perry Zurn, and really excited to have him here with us from American University. Wanted to give you all a little bit of an introduction. Again, another one of our distinguished guests with the long bio, but I'll just talk a little bit about his work, researches in political philosophy, gender theory, and applied ethics, with special expertise in curiosity studies. That's what we're going to be hearing about today. Also does critical prison studies, transgender theory. Zurn is the author of Curiosity and Power, Politics of Inquiry, and the co-author of Curious Minds from MIT Press. There's a lot more, but I want to give Perry time to present his own material. So again, thank you so much for coming to our talk today. We will talk for about 40-50 minutes, and then you can address questions. So everybody in the audience, please start putting your questions up in the Q&A forum, and I'll pick a couple that we'll answer live. We'll also, at the end of the session, you're free to leave at 12:50, but we'll stay online to answer live questions for anybody that would like to. All right, so let's have Dr. Perry Zurn take it away.
Great. Thanks so much for your hosting me today. I really appreciate the chance to have this conversation about curiosity, about current projects as well as past projects. I'm most excited to engage in the discussion afterwards, so please do put your questions in the Q&A box. I'll be excited to hear about those. I'm going to share my screen so we can get through some slides here that help enliven my discussion. So the talk today is entitled Questioning Our Questions. And I'm proposing that the task or the exercise of questioning our questions enhances our self-knowledge. So where are our questions coming from, and why do we have those questions? It's a way of getting to know ourselves. But at the same time, one of the things I'll propose is that questioning our questions is necessary in order to further the cause of social justice in the world. So I want to dig into that and see what you think. How do we start questioning our questions? I'll start with just these two questions here. Where do questions come from, and where are they going? Where do they come from, and where are they going? We don't always realize or think about the fact that our questions come from somewhere. They're just not appearing out of thin air, and that they go somewhere. They do something in the world. And so I want to attend to both of those levels. I'll be dipping into some of the work I've done on the possible roots of questions or our curiosity in our personalities. So the kinds of questions that we ask or the kinds of curious people we are tends to be connected to the kind of person that we are or our personality. I'll also be talking about the role of curiosity and questions in political resistance movements, and you might think about current political resistance movements, but also past ones in that regard. And then I'll be finishing with a kind of a reflection on the relationship between our questions, the questions you ask, the questions I ask, and prior questions we've heard or inherited from some other place in the world or in history, and what should be our relationship, or what should the relationship be between the questions that we ask and the ones that we've heard and perhaps are pushing forward in our own inquiries. So those are the three tracks I'm going to follow today. I want to just start with an admission that I am a humanist, a proud humanist, and that means that when I ask things like, how is our curiosity rooted in our personality, I will typically turn to books. That is part of my methodology. I do not turn to questionnaires in this case, as a psychologist might. So one of the things I've done is studied how curiosity and questions get talked about over the course of Western thought, and in particular canonical Western philosophy texts. And it's really fascinating when you key into not how curiosity is defined in these texts, but how it's described or characterized. And the more I checked out these passages and compared books to each other, I realized the way that folks are talking about or characterizing curiosity typically falls into about 3 types. So first, folks will characterize curious people, or people who ask a lot of questions, as those who love to collect information, collect or gather, folks who love to tell stories and to gossip. So they collect a lot of stories and like to share a lot of stories. That's one way of characterizing a curious person. The second way that's really common is to use the language of hunting. So we want to hunt down our answer. We want to track down the answer. We want to focus in on, and in some cases, sniff out. There's a lot of language of smelling, as if one were a hound of some kind. And that's a different kind of curiosity. It's much more targeted. And then there's a third way in which these texts, again, thousands of years worth of texts, characterize a curious person, and that's someone who's creative or imaginative. So when they ask questions, it's not because they just want to collect a bunch of information or answer a specific question, but they ask these questions that kind of just break open the world in the moment of the question. You just think, wow, how did you get there? And what does the world look like now, right? It's just creative, it's imaginative, and a lot of times the passages will use the language of dancing or of leaping. When you ask these kind of questions that dance with ideas or that leap from where you are to a whole new place, that's a third way in which curiosity is kind of characterized. And so I've tried to narrow these down or kind of pin them down in some way as 3 styles of asking questions or of being a curious person. On the one hand, you have the busybody, which is a sort of older word, but it means someone who's busy with a lot of people investigating all kinds of information. There's no real rhyme or reason, but you like to know a lot of things about a lot of things from a lot of places and a lot of people. The hunter, who does that more focused inquiry, who really likes to pursue one question very carefully and meticulously and then come to an answer that's considered and reflective. And then the dancer, someone who's in their curiosity creating new ideas constantly. It's a very artistic process of question asking. Now, these do not have to be the end-all be-all. You might think, I don't think I'm any of these. I think I'm a different sort. And I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A. If you think there should really be a 4th or even a 5th or a 6th type of curious person, we can tackle that. But I do want to, in this case, zero in and just talk about, if you're this kind of person, any one of these kinds of people, you will craft your knowledge, or you'll build your knowledge in different ways, in different architectures. So if you have a busybody-like curiosity that's really wide-ranging, and you like to collect lots of different bits of information, your knowledge network, or the architecture with which your knowledge is, one piece of knowledge is connected to another piece of knowledge, which is connected to another, that architecture or that network is going to be generally pretty loose. You know a little bit about this, a little bit about this, a little bit about that, right? Loose network of knowledge. But big, spans a lot of space. The hunter, on the other hand, their knowledge networks are going to be far more tightly built. So I know this piece of information, which attaches to this piece of information, which attaches to this piece of information, and you just build it really, really carefully. And so your knowledge is not super broad, but it's very deep and it's very tightly interconnected. And then the dancer. This person is a little bit more, because of their creative question asking, they might dig into something for a minute or for weeks, but then think, oh, what if that was related to this thing I barely know anything about? And they jump, right? They do this leap, and that creates what I call a stringy knowledge network. So you can have tight kind of nodules of information and then big jumps. So this is, again, 3 styles of curiosity that we find in classical philosophical texts. Fascinating. But what's even more fascinating is that if you look at archives of political resistance or political protests, one of the things that you'll see is that all 3 styles of curiosity or asking questions are used over and over and over again in these movements. So I focused on the one hand on the civil rights movement to really dig into how questions were used during the civil rights era. I've done a lot of work on prison resistance efforts and thought about how questions or curiosity are used in those initiatives in the US and particularly in Europe. And then I've also focused on transgender and disability rights activism. And again, how do questions show up? How are they used as a technique of protest? And in each case, you'll see a correlation to the styles we just chatted about. So your style in the world. Many of these protest movements begin by asking what is going on. Say, yeah, something's up, something's wrong. What is really going on? Let's collect information about the thing that's going on that we're concerned about. Let's collect information. Let's hear it from you. 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 From all these kinds of people, but also lots of different places of media and data gathering. And let's tell those stories. So a lot of times that's a first step of a protest movement. But then you need another step. So you figured out something's going on. And here are all here's the proof of what's going on. That's a problem. Now we need to get people to focus on it. So when you zero in on the problem and say, this is the thing that needs to change, this is the thing we need to think about, this is the thing we need to reconceptualize and change, that's more of a kind of hunter-like curiosity, asking what do we need right here in this with regard to this problem. But there's also always in these political resistance movements a moment for dreaming, a moment for imagination, for risk-taking, for visioning, saying, wow, what if the world could really look differently? What if everything that I think has always been or kind of has to be, what if it didn't have to be that way? How could we do things differently? So this is that dancer-like curiosity, that more creative curiosity. Now, I'll give you more concrete examples. I just wanted to give you a broad stroke picture here. So the concrete examples, for instance, from the civil rights movement, they began by collecting the facts about segregation rates, about assaults, about burning and bombing of Black homes and Black churches at the time, employment and housing discrimination rates. And if you look at this book, We Charge Genocide, it's a mammoth proof text to say, this is what's going on. Look at all of these instances of what shouldn't be happening. But in addition to that collection of information, there's also a move to problematize race, to say, this is what we need to pay attention to. We need to pay attention to race and how racialization, specifically anti-Blackness, is being mobilized in the US, right? And that involved for them public protests, certainly, often involving walking. So you could think of the Montgomery to Selma walks, sit-ins, lobbying, a number of things. So their actions were a way to say, this needs to be now a question that we listen to, right? How is racialization happening in the US, racial project, specifically of anti-Blackness? And then imagining a new future. And you can start with MLK's I Have a Dream speech, but go a lot further than that. There's so much imagination in movements such as this, and in the Black Lives Matter movement today, to say, how else could we live with one another? How else could we address a history of slavery in the US, for example? But I've also done some work, this is just another concrete example, on what was called the PISAR movement, which is the People in Search of Safe and Accessible Restrooms movement. And this was at the University of Santa Barbara, University of California, Santa Barbara in the early 2000s. And this movement was an organization of students, staff, faculty, community partners who were part of the trans or the disability community. And they came together to say, you know what, there just aren't restrooms that are accessible to us. There aren't safe, good places for us on campus. And what should we do about that? But their first move is to collect the facts. So they did these things called PISAR patrols, where they literally went all over campus and recorded what are the signs on all of the bathrooms, every single bathroom. What are the signs? Or do they say gender neutral? Do they say all gender? Do they say men? Do they say women? Do they not have a sign except for an accessibility sign, right? What are the signs? What are the measurements for the stall, for example, or the urinals, or the soap dispenser? What about the changing table? Are there changing tables? And a bunch of different amenities as well. So what's actually there on campus, and why is it that there are so few accessible restrooms? But then once you have all that information, what do? You have to make the restroom a problem for the campus. So they did this, and a question for the campus. So they did this questions campaign where they would take flyers and write big, bold questions about, do you ever have to worry about the next time that you're going to need to use a restroom? Plastered it all over campus to get people to focus on, this is a problem, we need to pay attention to this, there's something we need to figure out here. And then imagine new futures. They would get together and just say, how else could we do this? What do we want to propose to the university administration that would solve this situation? So you have to imagine, you have to do that creative work. One of the outputs of the group was this list of gender neutral bathrooms on the campus. And what's interesting about this list is that you can see depicted that kind of busybody-like curiosity that collected a lot of information, but also a hunter-like focus that organizes and articulates, these are the places, if you need an accessible restroom, go here. But also the hope that one could imagine that one wouldn't need such a list in a sense, but you could know that in every building or on every floor, there's a place that you can use without trouble. My last foray here into questioning our questions begins like this. We've talked a little bit about personal questions. So how do we personally ask questions? And where does that come from? What are the styles of our own curiosity? And then we've talked about political questions. How do we mobilize our questions in a world where we can achieve change with those questions? But I also want to talk about how those personal and those political questions often have roots in the past, are often building on questions that we've inherited in some way. And the question is, what do we do about that? And how do we know where our questions, where and how we've inherited our questions? And what's important for me here especially is to realize or to remember that curiosity and our questions, they're not always new. So sometimes people think, questions, curiosity, that's when I ask something new, right? That's not always true. A lot of times we ask questions that are quite old, actually, and that can be good and that can be bad. Some old questions we need to let go of, and some old questions we really need to hold on to. So to think, here I'm trying to think not of curiosity or questions as these newfangled things that push us into new spaces. Sometimes they do that, but a lot of times they're also holding down some old things. And that calls for an ethical evaluation of what do we want to hold on to. So Fred Moten, in his book, The Undercommons, one of the things he writes about is the freedom schools, which were free schools for Black students in the South during the Civil Rights movement. And he says there were two questions that were super important or pivotal for the freedom schools. What do we have that we need to keep? So you think about curriculum, for example, in these schools. What do we have that we need to keep? And what do we not have that we need? So what are the ways of asking questions that we need to hold on to and we need to keep? But what are the ways in which we need to change how we ask questions, how we pursue information, and how we communicate and share that information and learn and grow? Cornerstone of that particular movement. Gloria Anzaldúa will say something similar. So when she writes in her book, Borderlands, she describes what she calls the new mestiza, which is a kind of subject or subjectivity that refuses to say, I'm just this or I'm just this, right? But is rooted in the borderlands for her and in border subjecthood, which means that for her, as a Chicana feminist, you are more than one thing. You are always more than one thing in negotiating those pieces of yourself or those parts of yourself. She says the new mestiza asks differently mixed and differently needed questions. And part of how she does that is by beginning to take inventory. That's the first step. If you want to grow into this form of a person that is grappling with the ambiguity of our existence and intersectionality of our identities. Take inventory. What have you inherited? What are the concepts, the ideas, the questions, the arguments, the values the social relations. What have you inherited? Take inventory of that. And then consciously rupture with the things that no longer serve you, that you don't want to have as a part of your life, in a sense. Right? Say, I'm going to let that go. And then create new perspectives. So it's not that you rupture with all of it, but you need to look at it. What have you inherited? And let go of some of this stuff. That's part of what it means to choose what kind of human you want to be in the world. So we have these old questions and we have these new questions. And here I'm really leaning on Alan Middleman, who wrote a book called Hope in a Democratic Age. And he says hope is also one of these things like curiosity, where people just think it's always about the future. We hope for new things, new futures. It's always out there, further out there. He says, I think sometimes we hope for old things to stay, right? Things that we already have, that we already care about. Sometimes we hope that we can hold on to that thing, right? Or that person. So he says we need to the book argues we need to rethink hope as both this conserving move, this holding on move, and this emancipatory or changing move that pushes us into a new space. And I'm arguing the same is true of curiosity. We need to think about curiosity in both ways too. So we inherit questions from our traditions, our histories, our canons. A lot of times we inherit unanswered questions. You could think about your discipline, that your major or your family questions, or your community questions that haven't been answered yet. And we inherit those and we can decide, are we going to pursue those? But then also new questions. So revolutions or protest resistance movements, obviously, innovations, creations, new questions. Those are all there to be made and to be built. And on the one hand, if you want to hold on to the old questions, you need to sustain some current projects, current relationships, current structures. You need to build into them, plug into them, hold them. But on the other hand, you also need to be ready to deconstruct some of our current projects, our current relationships, our current structures, so that you can move into a new space. So this leaves us with, I think, this particular question. Where do I get our questions? Who do you read? Who do you follow on social media? Who do you hang out with? And what histories are you committed to learning? Because it's there that our questions are, in a sense, being born, being cultivated, being nurtured. They're questions that become kind of settle into us and then come out of us, and they feel like they're ours in a sense, but they're really coming from a communal and a social place. And so if you want to choose what kind of questions you're going to bring to the world, you need to think conscientiously about what communities you're really settling into, so you can kind of pull forward those questions, right? People with the kind of values you want to hold, and build questions together. Help you figure out which old questions you want to hold on to and which new ones you need to think about. All of that is done in community. And I'll give you a little bit of an example here of citations. So this might sound really boring, but it's not. So all of us, right, we write papers, you all write papers, we professors write papers, and we all have citations at some point. Sometimes there's a lot and sometimes there's not that many. Whatever we're doing when we use citations, we are at least saying that these questions and these insights of these authors matter to the question I'm asking in this paper. That's what a citation does, right? These questions, these insights matter to what I'm doing in this paper. That means that our papers, our citations are a record of old questions that matter to us in some way. And I've been involved in a really interesting collaboration with folks in neuroscience. And we've recently released a paper on citation practices in neuroscience. And what's fascinating is that neuroscience as a field in general has been diversifying. That means it has a lot more women and people of color scientists in the field, but their citation practices as a field have become less diverse as the people in the field have become more diverse. How does that happen, right? It's getting worse with time. So the diversification of people in the field is getting better, and the diversification of citations in the field is getting worse. And one of the things that we hypothesize and we show in the paper is that primarily this has to do with, well, that particular paper is on specifically on gender, and men scientists in general will oversight themselves or other men, and women will tend to, and then they'll undercite women. And we're doing a similar project on the racialization of citations. But one of the key factors, if you want to be one of those scientists or one of those theorists or one of those philosophers who does in fact cite and rely on a diverse range of questions and people, it matters most who you work with. So there's a really neat depiction in the paper of your network, your social network as a scholar. And if that social network is diverse, you are far more likely to have an unbiased representation of your citations, of who you're leaning on as the kind of leaders of the questions in your field. So that's just an example. So these are the three things I leave you with. What is your style of asking questions? Let's talk about it. Did the styles I talk about above, did they ring true? You think there's some other ones? Let me know. Number two, how can you use your way of asking questions to make a difference in the world? How have you already used your way of questions to make a difference in the world? And then who are you asking questions with? And I mean that today, you know, who are you with? Who are you hanging out with and thinking about and talking to and following today? But also, what kind of histories are you committed to knowing? So are you committed to knowing about, for example, history of anti-Black racism in this country? Are you committed to knowing the history of indigenous life in this country? Those kind of questions. Which histories? Because then you'll learn questions that you can carry on. Different questions, right? Who are you asking questions with? All right, so those are my big picture questions for you. And lastly, I just want to let you know that one of my books, Curiosity Studies, is out and it's free online. And that is an active link. I don't know if it'll be visible on the recording, but you can absolutely Google Curiosity Studies and you will find an online version of it. What's really exciting is that the website that has the book also has a series of a podcast series hosted by Lynn Borton, who runs a podcast called Choose to Be Curious, and she's interviewed all the contributors. And these are, 20 some odd minute episodes that are just fascinating. I mean, if you don't even have to get to the book in a sense, but listen into these episodes on curiosity, and these are all cross interdisciplinary and really, really cool things. And then my own book, Curiosity and Power, The Politics of Inquiry, will be out in April, so check it out when it is released. And now I'm super excited for your questions.
Okay, thanks so much for that. There's a whole lot to discuss here. There's a bunch of really interesting questions up here. I'm going to pick a couple that I think are particularly good. So first one's from Jet. How can we question ourselves in an open and honest way to help us become better at realizing things we need to find solutions to, work on in certain situations, and how that will enhance our way of life?
Yeah, this is a wonderful question. So how do we actually do it? How do we question ourselves? How do we notice things about ourselves that need to be subject to question? Because it's so easy to just, in a sense, go about your daily life. But I think the more a good friend of mine, Liam Hennigan, who's a professor of environmental studies at DePaul University, one of the things he says is that we have to pay deep attention to the ordinary and realize how strange it is. So whatever you find, you say, I've never thought about that, right? Stop right there. Take the thing that you think you've never thought about and think about it deeply and see what about it is really kind of odd and strange and demands a different relationship to it for you. I'll give you an example. So one of the things I've been thinking about is walking. And you might think walking is, kind of boring. Everybody does it for all kinds of reasons. I don't know. It seems mundane, right? But if you think about it more, you start to perhaps recall things like Trayvon Martin was simply walking, right? And you might think about who and what can walk safely and not worry about where they're walking or why they're walking that way. You might think about the disability community and what walking means for them and how they talk about walking and how they experience walking. So walking is this thing that is that ordinary familiar bit, but the minute you start digging into it, there's a lot more there. And I think it's through that kind of attention that you can start asking deeper questions about yourself and your way in the world.
Excellent. So this next question is something that dovetails with what I'm interested in finding out from you as well. It seems like what you're talking about is very much a practice. So Trent asks, is there a way to practice thinking like another class? Like I feel like a busybody, but sometimes I wish I could be like a hunter or a dancer. And this I would like to build on this question and say, you know, a lot of times in university settings, we have discipline-based practices for questioning, and it's going to be different in science, it's going to be different in social science, it's going to be different in the humanities. So how do we build a practice that's perhaps, are you arguing for us to build a practice that's maybe a little bit more multidisciplinary?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think I definitely do think about curiosity as a practice rather than as some secret thing you just carry around with you. So a lot of times, sometimes for instance in psychology, but also just in everyday life, people will talk about, well, I'm just curious. It just happened. It's just there. But I think it's something that we do. Curiosity is something that we do. Questions are something that we ask. They're something that we extend into the world, and we have to do something to make that happen. So I think that I really like to think about curiosity and questions as practices. And then the question is, well, what kind of practice, what kind of way of doing that do I want to support or do I want to cultivate in myself? And certainly, I think that different disciplines, kind of dipping into different disciplines, does help us do that thing of paying attention to the ordinary way of asking questions in one discipline, and helps you say, oh wow, actually that's kind of strange because in this discipline they do it this way. So it can, that interdisciplinarity can help with the insight into the strangeness of how we've each chosen, how disciplines have chosen to organize their questions. But also, so interdisciplinary, yes, but also I think that the history of every discipline is, in a sense, a tortured thing. So people have been arguing, whatever discipline you're in, people have been arguing about how to do it right for too long. And that means that you can dig into that history and you can start to say, oh, wow, some people said we should ask these questions this way, but other people say we should ask these questions this way. So you can get that same attention if you go broad with the interdisciplinary attention or deep into the history of any given field. You can get that same, wow, actually, I don't know. How should I ask this question? How should I write this paper? How should I approach this concept? I don't know. So that's a place to begin.
Excellent. Okay. So Ryan would like to know, is your curiosity style something you develop on your own, or is it inherited through something like genetics? Yeah, so what's the family lineage of questioning?
Yeah, great question. I don't really know enough about how we inherit things biologically, for example. I don't know. And so there could be a component there, but there's certainly a modeling. I think that many times we develop our way of asking questions by modeling ourselves on other people in our life. So that could be our family, it could be our schools, it could be our friends, it could be whoever we follow on social media more generally. So I think we pick up on ways of doing things based on who we're surrounded by. And I don't think that has to determine necessarily your style, because again, I do think sometimes this is rooted in a more individual personality sort of thing. But I do think that, let's say you are a hunter, or you are a busybody, or you are a dancer. The way that you go about being that kind of a curious person is typically fashioned or informed by other people you see that you say, oh, they're kind of like me and they do it this way. So I definitely think there's a social component there.
Mhm. Yeah, and that leads us into this next question, which I think is really critical for the times that we live in. And Trent would like to know, in the age of misinformation, how can we make sure we are asking the right questions, right? Because we could be getting poison questions from our social networks.
Yes, that is critical for these times. Absolutely. So it's very clear to us. I think when I started working on this, it was harder to convince people that we inherit our questions,
Mhm.
or that we end up sort of parroting the questions around us. But when you see the effects of media, um, politicized media in particular, on the kinds of questions that people are asking about anything from COVID to the presidential election to the economy, um, it's very clear that our questions aren't these things, again, that start somewhere deep inside of us and just pop out, but we're saturated in a world of asking questions, a world that's constantly asking questions, and we're born into it, and then we get to choose kind of which rivers we start um, to follow, I guess, to live in. So by which rivers, I mean which discourses or which bodies of information. So in an age of misinformation, where are you going to get your information? That's going to that choice, that attention is going to dramatically affect what kinds of things you can find questionable and how you can pursue those questions.
Mhm.
So that just, to me, that just, the contemporary times make more pointed the necessity of attending to where we're getting our questions.
Right, and one of the main issues, I think, would be the fact that it's hard to know. There isn't an accurate trail of where these ideas come from, and this is because a lot of these discourses have been weaponized, specifically to cause chaos. Right, we're in a sense in an information war, and and where these questions come from, you don't know. Are they're occluded or they're misattributed, right? And then backed up with misinformation. So I think it's just a really difficult job for people to make sense of where this comes from. In a sense, causing a lot of people to give up on political discourse, which is actually the job of the people that were trying to get us to do that in the first place.
Yeah, I agree. And I think um, one of the ways that I go there, so there's always going to be new facts floating around that you have to fact check, or new information that you have to be careful about how you decide or to believe it or not to believe it. But at the same, so that kind of vigilance is necessary. But I also think that we can again lean on these. What are our values? And what are the communities that we want to be listening to and showing up for? And I think that can often be an anchor in the storm of information. So it's not just that there's misinformation, but we are in an information age where we're just saturated day in and day out with new information. And the newness of the information doesn't necessarily, whether it's true information or not true information, the newness doesn't necessarily help us become better humans. But I think returning, in a sense, to our values and our communities and who we want to show up for can be that that ship in the storm that can hold, that kind of hold us down in a world that just is, batting us around a little bit.
Excellent. Okay, so building on that is a good question from Allison, who this relates to your discussion on citations, and she wants to know: are there other examples of things that keep a record of old questions we had other than citations? Or are there other ways we can build up our own a sense of reputation and value in the questions that we have?
Yeah. Well, So I think we refer to things all the time in our speech. So citations are something that marks our written work, but we can refer to things in our speech or in our tweets or in our Facebook posts or in our artistic work or our films. There's often references to other films or other artistic creators embedded in that project. And all of those references are ways of saying, oh, this question or this questioner, I'm aligning myself in some way with that work and finding it useful and valuable. So I think citations is a really academic version of something we do all the time. I heard so-and-so say, I read this, I listened to this, I love this podcast. You know, my artistic practice is rooted in so-and-so's practice. All of those are references, and those references carry this legacy of curiosity forward. So we can pay attention to all of those things.
So you're talking about things less informal, like callbacks, Easter eggs, shout outs, that kind of thing that you see
Right.
in media
Yeah.
as well. Mm-hmm. Excellent. Okay, so building on our discussion about citations, Madison asks, what do you mean when you say that citations have decreased? I think she's referring to the diversity of citation, right?
Right. So in that case, I was studying the work on neuroscience as a field, and we studied just the top 5 journals in the field, and we looked at the reference list, so the citation list in every article for these top 5 journals over the last several decades. And it's in those lists, when you start looking at who everybody is citing, you start to see that they're citing less and less diverse group of people. And that seems strange in a world in which in an academic discipline that is itself diversifying, but also in a world in which we feel that we are more alert to the value of different voices on any given issue.
So one of the things I was thinking about there is when a discipline starts, there's a lot of different people in it, and if their questions are good questions, then the field develops more. Graduate students get involved, and then it starts to diversify. But then you get this this kind of long tail problem, right, where it's the initial people that continue to get cited, and all the new people get rarely cited. So so you have if it was just a bunch of white guys that started the field, then it's going to be them that get cited over everybody else. Is that sort of what you're talking about?
Yes, except we control for that.
Okay.
So, and we would have to do that in a field like philosophy as well, which primarily most of the canonical authors early on for the first, 2000
Thousands of years.
Yeah, are men, right? So you need to control for that in the study, and even when you control for that, the citations are not balanced in the way they should be.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. All right, so got a really good question here from Jess Miller. What do you have to say about the people that are more resistant to change and thus aren't willing to ask new questions in the first place? I have family members like this around me, so it's not exactly easy to have the paradigm shift. Yeah, we've got Thanksgiving's coming up, right? A lot of really difficult questions are going to be asked around the table. What do you have to say about this?
This is a tough one, and I feel it personally. I have those family members as well, and I guess one of the tactics that you might use is, I don't know. This is tough, and I think it's going to depend on your relationship to the people you're talking about. But I think it's helpful to highlight that this just continuing to believe a certain thing or to do the world a certain way isn't actually easier, because it proliferates a kind of pain or inequality that doesn't go away. So it's not as it, and that's not easy. So if you hang out with that, right, the way that we're doing things is causing this kind of pain or this kind of suffering or this kind of inequality. If you stay there long enough, it feels there's something I think that shifts in the conversation where yeah, that feels like a lot to take on and to just stay the way I've been forever. Um, to really realize that you're just perpetuating that experience. But that has to be sharing, I think, personal stories. It can't just be numbers. I mean, numbers are important too, but and sharing why you care about the new questions you're asking. Getting vulnerable about that, I think, can reach places in people that are hard to get to.
Right. Yeah. Because a lot of times it's just about family dynamics and power, and getting beyond that is, and getting into a real discussion can be difficult. That brings up a question. I'm gonna hijack things a little bit and ask you, how much in your work are you relying on concepts of discourse ethics, because it seems really key to what you're talking about, and then also virtue ethics, because it sounds like you're trying to develop a particular practice of virtuous question asking.
Yes, so that's really central. That's in the background. You're right to hear it. The ethics, information ethics, discourse ethics, and curiosity, wondering how curiosity itself can be a virtue. So historically, and you may know this, but historically, especially in philosophy, but also in Western thought more generally, curiosity was considered a vice. So I'm thinking about in the sort of ancient Greek and Roman period, as well as the medieval period. And it's really only in the early modern period that curiosity starts to have a little bit of a, maybe it's a virtue and a vice, there's a little bit of this dance. And now we're at a place where if you Google curiosity, it's just the best thing.
Right.
So, I mean, it's in all of our college and university mission statements, and, it's in our business and tech sectors. This is the thing. You should be curious. It's a good thing. So there's been a lot of, and that's interesting. It's interesting to think about what a shift of opinion has occurred about curiosity over time. But I want to ask, not is curiosity wholesale good or bad, but when you think about it as a practice, when and how is it a good, a virtuous, and ethical practice? What characterizes curiosity or questions in those moments? And how can we understand that a little bit better and then practice that better? So yes, that's all really there for me.
Yeah, thank you. And Ashley asks, has there been studies as yet of there being a possibility of more types of curious minds rather than 3 that were discussed?
Not published yet. So, but one of the things I've been doing is going back through precisely that same data set, essentially those same texts, or the canonical texts in Western thought and Western philosophy. And I've been noticing the way the animals that are used as metaphors of curiosity. Sometimes it's a cow, sometimes it's a bird, sometimes it's a frog, sometimes it's an octopus, sometimes it's a, and in a sense, I'm collecting a bestiary there, a bestiary of curiosity. And I think in each of those cases, we might then have a much bigger set of kinds or types or styles of curiosity if we follow that line. So I'm working on that.
Yeah, and in the along the lines of the bestiary, in a world with so many questions, old and new, an anonymous questioner asks, how do we know what questions matter the most to humankind? How do people with a hunter style pick which questions to zero in on given little time we have in such a dangerous time in the United States? So yeah, how do we get beyond just the loudest question wins?
That's a great question, and in particular, the attention to what does our world need and what does our Earth need. So I think what are the most important questions for these big bodies of world or Earth or humankind? For me, that requires listening doing a lot of listening. So I think the hunter often wants to just have a question, do the thing. But I actually think that for the hunter to be an ethical hunter, they need to start as a busybody in the sense of listening to a lot of people. Listen especially to people who are saying this thing isn't working for us. So I'm thinking about environmental devastation in a bunch of places and the communities that it's most affecting there. For example, listen there and say, what are the questions that those folks are saying? You need to ask this question. We need answers to this question. Because and that's precisely not listening to the loudest question. That's probably listening to the softest question. These communities that are most affected and most silenced in a lot of cases by the booming loud info wars that you're talking about.
Right, right. Excellent. Well, great. Well, that takes us up to our 12:50 time spot. So I know a lot of our audience has to move on to their next class. So thank you guys for coming. I'm going to leave the line open and we're going to work through another couple of questions just to simulate how we would speak to each other after the class if this had been a live event. So you're welcome to stay, any of you in the audience. Otherwise, thank you so much, and we'll see you again next week for a really fabulous discussion like we have every week. And thanks for coming. All right, so let's dig through a little bit more of these. I'm going to go to the ones that are that were asked later, because those are people that are probably still here. So another anonymous attendee asks, how does one balance the three types of curious minds? Is there one that is better than the others?
Great. I think the balance is going to be unique to each of us in some way. But as I said, I do think they work well together. I do think that especially the busybody is this person who you can lean into the busybody's ability to listen, and that's going to be critical for the generation of new questions or the holding on of old questions. And the hunter obviously is going to be really effective in getting some answers. And then the dancer, you know, one of the things about the busybody and the hunter is they kind of stay in the realm of information that we have, or the realm of discourse that we already have. And the dancer is saying we need to break out of that and go somewhere else also. So I think we might each of us really lean toward one or the other, and that's fine. But I think developing our capacity for all three is going to be important.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that reminds me, you know, when we're thinking about questioning as a skill and as a newly valued virtue, when it's been not valued, as you say, historically. And I think that that's probably also true for most of the world, right? When we say it's picked up a new value in culture, that's a modern, that's not only a modern thing, that's a regional thing. And I think if you looked at, you know, most of the countries in the world, being the person who is the quester into questions is not a highly valued thing, or it's a dangerous or fraught social position to be in. So I think that therefore this is sort of a new skill, right? And it's almost like trying to be trying to break new ground. If you, especially people like us, humanities people, you look at these older sources, they're not going to be really excited about breaking new ground. You know, I think I noticed that you know, the first philosopher to even consider truth as something that is not just from the past would be Bacon, right? Truth is the daughter of time is his bumper sticker. So how are we going to bust through that big weight that I think still hangs on humanity?
Yeah, I think I think that one of the places I go here is I I go to Michel Foucault, and his work on genealogies,
Mhm.
because one of the things he likes to do is he likes to dig into histories and find new possibilities that are kind of hidden there and weren't really taken advantage of. So in the same way, I think that yes, we need to have this pressure toward breaking new ground, yes. But also sometimes that new ground can be buried in our pasts somewhere. And so to me, reading the old texts is just as exciting as reading the new text, because I do think there's new possibilities in both of them.
Mhm.
And what we're going to have to practice is just the attentiveness to detail. So especially in older text or newer text, what's kind of underneath the thing that they're saying?
Right.
You
Mhm.
know, what are like the moving parts that you can't quite see that could open a different door that they didn't walk through, but you could.
Right. Mhm. Fascinating. Yeah, I think that's really an important thing that your work is opening the door to our thoughts, and really been excited about this talk today. Roger asks us, is there a way to instill people to question their beliefs when they believe things like QAnon and other, it says finding, but I think funny ideas is what he means.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, can you answer that question for my critical thinking class? Because this is what the whole class is about, and I'm having a hard time answering that question myself.
Yeah, well, I think one of the things you could do is think about when you last really thought through something you hadn't wanted to revisit and you really hadn't changed your mind about for a really long time, right? But what's a moment where you've really changed, and what were the conditions for
Mhm,
you to change your mind?
mhm,
And I think I think that if we can pull that, really get clear on that picture, what it is taken for you to for me to change my mind about something,
mhm,
and how can I practice being in that space more often, coming to that kind of, I think, openness, that kind of humility, that I probably haven't figured it out, and in fact I'm probably way off on some things,
mhm.
and that's okay. And being a human means staying with that, I think, rather than kind of closing off and saying, nope, I got it, and everybody should come over here with me, right?
Right,
Because if you do that, it's easy for your interlocutor to do that, and
right.
then we're just stuck.
Mhm.
So
Yeah, and I think we have this, that we've inherited in some ways this idea that we are the lone intellect, right, that has the capacity to take on ideas and shed other ideas as the evidence provides us, right? This is sort of the heroic scientist model of questioner. Um, Whereas in reality, uh, certain questions can form, uh, can constitute the core of our identity, right? So if I'm a QAnon adherent, that is part of my identity. I wear the shirts, I got the sign, I've got the American flag, right? I really care. I really convinced myself that I care deeply about the plight of children, right, and sex trafficking across the United States. And I'm not just going to drop, this idea that vast amounts of sex trafficking is going on, and that I need to do something about it. It becomes too much of the core of that person's belief. Um, so you're not going to change the mind of that person at that level. Uh, what you can do, I think, is work on orbiting beliefs, things that orbit around that, right? So you can't go to somebody's core belief. It's like this is how they get people out of cults, right? You don't pull at the thing at the center, because that just destroys the person's mind. You have to work your way in, right? And then you're basically building a new identity, right? This is a hard and difficult problem.
yeah, well, and I do think shifting away from the believe this thing, don't believe this thing, believe this thing.
Hmm. Yeah.
shifting away from the emphasis on the right body of belief, shifting instead to practices. What kind of practices of openness, of humility, of reevaluation, of putting myself in places where I listen to people who have really different experiences than me. Those practices, I think, will create a more flexible but also a more dynamic selfhood that allows for a more breakdown of this incredible polarization we're seeing.
Mm-hmm. I've got two really good more questions here that just came in. Why am I being constantly censored? Asked Scott. How do we normalize new questions of revolution as a potential reality for the future, especially considering the need for revolution, i.e., rupturing from capitalism to mitigate the suffering due to climate change, white supremacy, patriarchy, etc.?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, how do we normalize change or revolution? Maybe by pointing out that change and revolution are actually pretty constant. So I think that a lot of times we or people live in a world in an illusion that it's kind of been kind of like this for most of the recent past.
Mm-hmm.
But really, change really, if we can highlight, no, it changed here and it changed here and it changed here and it keeps changing here and look at this. Like, humans are constantly recreating their space. Then the question is not, well, I just want to, change or don't be changed, but rather it's how to change.
Mm-hmm.
How do we want to change, given that change will occur,
Mm-hmm.
given that revolution will occur? Which revolution do we want to get behind? That's more of I think you shift the territory there.
Yeah, one of the things I notice, being a somewhat amateur history reader, is that cultures will have these big revolutionary changes, and then they will modify their ideas to make it seem like they had always been this way, right? So the new power structure builds this hegemonic history behind it as if it was always this way, right? And forget, and trying to cover up the fact that I think what you're saying is absolutely correct. There's always revolution, even within, there's revolution within Trump's own cabinet, right, on a daily basis, and so, but they like to project this picture as if it's always been this way, and we're just going to keep it this way.
Right.
Mm-hmm. Here's a great question that I think is also vital to our times. So Roger asks, also search engines sometimes don't help with questioning. So, and I'd like to add to that and say, search engines, don't they kind of create your questions? Like now, when you type into Google, as you're typing, right, it already has finished your question, and you might just hit enter, right? It doesn't allow you to think through your question. It fills in where your question should go, and then you hit enter, and it takes you there to places that it already has answers for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do we do about search engines? Is that the question?
Yeah. Yeah, let's just solve that.
Yeah. I mean, that's probably not, that's not something I can really do in a sense. I think that we need people who are thinking about the ethics of curiosity in those rooms building those algorithms.
Mm-hmm.
And because on the one hand, yeah, it's supposed to be helpful, right? The algorithms learn what it is that you're typically most interested in and therefore can fill in probably where you're going. But that also means that in a sense, they trap you into what you've already thought about or already leaned toward and not helping you lean out of that.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, search engines at this point are not really that helpful, but again, I would go back to who are the people that you choose to be in conversation with, and put yourself in places with people with really different life experiences,
Mm-hmm.
because the things that they will share will not be what you expect. They will break your way of seeing the world.
Mm-hmm.
And that's just that's a tried and true method of challenging yourself to grow in certain ways.
Right, and I think that's one of the reasons why travel, right, does that for you, and anything that takes you out of your bubble. Unfortunately, our technology seems to be wanting to wrap us in a bubble, and it can wrap us in a bubble even when we travel now, right? You could be in a really amazing, exciting place, and you're still on your damn phone because we have worldwide coverage for the internet now. It's really, really tragic.
Right.
So let's see. So we are now past our 1 o'clock hour. So I think I would like to there's still a few people hanging out in the room. If you would like to talk live, any of you, I think that would be a great way to do it. So just raise your hand. I'll hit the button and it'll allow you to talk. Otherwise, I will dig through a couple more questions. I'm trying to look at the attendees and try to match questions to people that might still be here. So Kaylee asks, how many people fall under just one category of curiosity styles? I feel that it may be hard to identify with just one, as different concepts are associated with different thinking processes based on the individual's experiences.
Yeah, I've spoken about these types of curiosity in multiple places over years now. And in almost every case, there's somebody who says, I'm just this one. This is the one. And there's always also somebody who says, I'm all of them. So I don't know. All I know is how people describe themselves at this point, which is some people are really tightly aligned with one and none of the others. And then some people think, no, they see themselves in all three.
Right. And then, so I was thinking when you were bringing up this topic, it seemed like there were other archetypes of questioners. So what about like the detective, the scientist? These are slightly different than the hunter. I mean, they're related, of course, but they're slightly different. Detective being trying to solve a particular issue and really interested in cause. A scientist maybe is more interested in phenomenon, might be interested in cause. So how do you reconcile some of these archetypes to that seem to fall outside of the three that you have in your talk?
Well, on the one hand, I'm not attached to them being the only three, so that's part of the way I handle it. But in fact, I'm excited to think that there would be more. Mm-hmm. They're just the ones that really jump out.
Oh, the engineer too. The engineer being a person who tinkers, right, with physical things and finds new ways for them to work.
Yeah, no, these are great. I mean, I do think that the scientist and the detective in general are more of this focused hunter-like. So I could see them being subsets, mm-hmm. subgenres of the hunter, perhaps. So you could do it mm-hmm. that way. Mm-hmm. The tinkerer is interesting. That's a little bit more of like the busybody in the sense that you're just like, nah, I don't know. I'm not sure what I'm doing or why I'm doing it, but I'll just see what happens. Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. But you can also revisit. So I'm a huge Sherlock Holmes fan. Mm-hmm. And if you hang out with Sherlock Holmes, one of the things that you see is that I think he does this collecting a lot of details about the case and then focusing in on sort of a hypothesis. Let's test this out. Let's kind of track that through a little bit. And then there's usually a light bulb moment that's like, what about this? You know, mm-hmm. which is more of the dancer at the end. So I actually see if you break down the detective, at least that model of detective life, you could track all three in there.
Yeah, I'm starting to like that. And while we were talking, I was just reminded of Carl Sagan. His argument in Demon Haunted World is that that he feels that the reason humans are good at science is because of our hunter-gatherer evolution, right? And that a hunter trying to track an animal, because we're persistent hunters, right? Was his argument. We don't just attack something and kill it. We wound it, and then we have to track it for miles and miles and miles. And that to him was the same thing as a hypothesis, and then you have to track it, long distance, uh, uh, experiment after experiment after experiment until you can actually come up with your finding.
Yeah, but also the hunter gatherer there. So we drop. Sometimes we forget about the gatherer, but
Right.
that gatherer is paying attention to, oh, bright berry, right?
Yep.
Hidden over here. Oh,
Yep.
another one over there. Much more of the busybody. I don't know. I'll notice the shiny thing wherever
Yep.
it is.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. No. I'm starting to like it. I think I was resistant to it originally, but now I'm starting to see that these might be the three primary archetypes from which you can mix and match to create these subgenres as well. Oh, here's a good one. Caitlin is asked, because we forgot to mention, childlike curiosity, right? I feel a lot of people see children as more curious than adults. Do you think that same level of curiosity we had as a child stays with us throughout life?
That's a great question and a tough question, because honestly, the child's brain is different. So when we are children, so much is new, so much is strange. And our own capacity to sort of process that and open up to that is really different than when our brains have matured. So I think there is necessarily a shift from a childlike curiosity to an adult curiosity. But I do think that if we can, as adults, practice precisely what I was saying, like paying new attention to ordinary things and realizing how strange they are. So it's the inverse of the child. The child's just like, whoa, that's weird, right? Cool, I'll think about it. What we need to do as adults is tackle the things that are really familiar and say, oh, but maybe they're actually kind of weird.
Right.
That's got to be the practice that gets us to a similarly childlike state.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it reminds me of when I was speaking with a Zen monk, and he was telling me that the process of Zen was essentially, like, he was just trying to come up with some way to help me understand it, right, which is hard, because it's a practice, not a discourse. And he said, well, think of trying to get back to the state that your brain was in as a baby, right, as an infant, actually an infant, not a child, and being able to build new connections and new worlds from that moment, because you could have been many different things as an infant. You solidified on one set of experiences that took you down this particular path. But is there a way to break your consciousness down to the point where you can start to see alternative paths, right?
That's fascinating. And I think that's one thing that I haven't really dug into yet is the resources in Eastern philosophy to think about curiosity. I think there's a lot of work that could be done there that would be really interesting.
Oh yeah, I think so. Yeah, it would be really great to get a panel and have some people from different perspectives on this. So here's another one from left field, but a couple summers ago, I was at a big think tank thing with lots of super high-powered people involved, and industry money involved in, and everything. And this topic came up, so I wanted to see what you think about it. So I had some neurosurgeons in there, or not surgeons, but neurologists, I guess. And they were interested in psychedelics, right? So I listened to a couple weeks of talk on how they thought that psychedelics was maybe a ham-handed way of doing this, but that there were ways of manipulating the brain so that new concepts, like I guess it's just sort of an express way to what the Zen monk was trying to tell me was a conceivable thing that human brains can do. So how does psychedelics work into your research? Maybe that's a personal question.
Personally, it doesn't work in my research. Does it? I don't know. So I don't have a lot of understanding of psychedelics at all, and I don't know how it relates to curiosity. What I might say, I could connect this to this practices of mindfulness, so
Yeah,
meditation practices, and these are typically shown to increase curiosity. So some really interesting work between mindfulness and curiosity, and meditation practices. So I think that there's clearly something there that activates the openness we associate with curiosity.
excellent. Well, very good. So I don't want to steal all your time today. You've been super generous with us so far. Um, so I think I'm going to turn off the recording and then we can chat a little bit and then say our goodbyes. So again, thank you so much, Perry, for joining us today. It's been a fascinating discussion.
Yeah, thank you.
You're welcome. And thanks everybody for coming. So here's our silent applause. You can't hear everybody clapping, but they are.